Good evening. This is Dr. Koehler, that is with us at the Eurogulf Information Center. We are currently discussing Dr. Koehler's work about Leone Caetani and East-West relations. I am Leone Radiconcini, PhD student in political studies and currently researcher at Eurogulf Information Center. And I would like to ask to Dr. Koehler, who is an important scholar of history and early Islamic economy, about his latest paper and some points that he discussed in it. My first question for Dr. Koehler is, do you think the Italian intellectual Caetani was a Cassandra, a neglected prophet whose advices, if followed, would have led to a more peaceful coexistence between the East and the West?
Leone Caetani was an outstanding intellectual of his era, not only of his era on the eve of World War I, but for the entire 20th century. He still speaks to us today as someone who is a contemporary. I find this especially surprising since Caetani was someone who was preoccupied with the past. But in 1911 and 1912, just as Italy embarked on an invasion and military campaign in a Muslim country and came to be disappointed at the backlash it experienced, here was Leone Caetani, who had no notion of how East-West relations would develop in the 20th century, who was speaking, you are saying, as a Cassandra, certainly with almost prophetic ability about the tensions between East and West, although at the time all he could go on was the invasion of Libya.
Well, thank you. I will go to the second question. That is, Samuel P. Huntington, that is very famous scholar that you mentioned in your work, and his theory about the clash of civilizations has been misinterpreted, consciously or not, by many. Do you believe that his work as a scholar is still valuable, even if we have a lot of political misinterpretations?
Yep. In Huntington, a highly accomplished Harvard political scientist, there are many layers of what he speaks of. The title has become a soundbite. When he first wrote that article, that term, Clash of Civilizations, there was a question mark. He dropped the question mark when it became a book. And he took that, he coined that phrase, that soundbite, taking it from the work of another scholar, Bernard Lewis. I suspect Professor Huntington would have appreciated with hindsight if his reviewers would have done a little bit more work into digging into what he was saying. However, remarkable Professor Samuel Huntington's work has been, I'm surprised that he was unaware of the work of Leone Caetani, and where Samuel Huntington, in speaking of differences between East and West and of revolutions which originate in religions, would go back as far as the Reformation of Protestantism in the 16th century, Leone Caetani goes all the way back to the war against Troy and the backlash from Asia against Christianity to Islam, and goes back so much further and digs so much deeper than Samuel Huntington did. And considering that Leone Caetani was writing in 1912, when Professor Huntington was writing in the 1990s, if you compare input and output of Caetani to input and output of Huntington, you see there's a mismatch.
Now I'll go a bit more in contemporary events. I want you to ask about your opinion as a scholar of history about the intervention in Libya in 2011. What is your perception of such an intervention? Is it something that is always related to the things that Caetani was pointing out? Is it something different?
The story of Libya in the 20th century is so sad, because it was a society which was quiescent, possibly phlegmatic, but it was not a country that was torn apart by civil war in all the centuries that it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. It was a perfectly pacific, still stretch of northern Africa where Italy then decided to establish its own dominion. And ever since, Libya has been suffering from foreign intervention, and not one of these foreign interventions has been a success. It is now over 100 years of learning experience in Libya, and we still seem not to have been able to give the people of Libya something which under Ottoman rule they had enjoyed for centuries.
And what is so I'll connect it to the next question that is always related to this point, because do you think that seems more like a rhetorical question at this point, do you think that East-West relations have changed nowadays or not?
I'm a great admirer of Caetani, and what I find remarkable is how he speaks of the unchanging tension between East and West, going back from the war against Troy, the invasion of Alexander the Great, the backlash by Mithridates against the West, the establishment of Christianity, the change in the character of Christianity in the Middle Ages, and Islam then as one of several, after several centuries of prehistory, as one of several reassertions of Eastern independence, and of Islam perceived in a way that I've not read elsewhere in Western literature, of Islam as a liberation of the East. Whereas in the West, currently in our discourse, we tend to think of Islam as being a force of repression. And I find it remarkable that Leone Caetani was able to see that from the Orient's point of view, Islam has been a liberation movement. This is something that is the case today. So in response to your query, do I think things have changed between East and West? My response is not really. Caetani is still ahead of us.
I'm going to ask you a last question. This is more an epistemological question than a definition of the studies. I wanted to ask you, because I noticed in your paper you're talking about the relation between history and political sciences, because of course you're quoting sentences from Caetani and sometimes even something from Huntington. So I wanted to ask you on an epistemological level, what do you think, because you say the relation between the two should not be stretched too much, of course, but what is the relation between the two? What do you think that political science and history, in which field can they work together? What is...
Yes, it's fascinating that we have somebody like Samuel Huntington, eminent political scientist, who represents the best of the intellectual traditions, the state of the art of social sciences of the 1980s, 1990s. And he's able to benefit from decades of development of social sciences in an era, in a generation, when the humanities seem to be becoming less and less important. And then you contrast him with someone like Leone Caetani, who was not a sociologist, who was not a political scientist, who was somebody who gathered old documents and sifted old documents. And how is it possible that an historian like Leone Caetani, with the tools available in 1912, would have a wider view, a deeper view of East-West relations than someone who had all the resources of Harvard University at his disposal as a political sciences 3 generations later? So I find that Leone Caetani, his philosophical and historical methodology, shows that the humanities are timeless, and that the insights, the lessons, the learning that one gleans from reading great historians are timeless and do not depreciate and do not have a sell-by date. And this is, with all respect to the marvelous achievements of social sciences, something that very few social scientists can claim for their own discipline.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Koehler, for this interview, and thank you for the description, the deep and careful description of a very important Italian scholar of Islam, and that's it. Thank you.
And I hope that Leone Caetani's article, which is digitized and available on the internet, was published in Scientia in 1912, I think. It's easy to find, and I hope being free of access and with not hiding behind a paywall, that it will find further readers. Thank you, Leone.
Thank you.